Hey Tony, it's Friday. It's actually Thursday, but I'm going to be all over the place tomorrow, so I'm making this video today because it's going to be a longer one because I actually want to dive into something a little more substantive than what I usually do. Well, usually I espouse philosophy. This one I actually want to get to something more substantive, more practical. But first off, to answer your question of the week, Tony, I think it's interesting. Although I was talking to a colleague of mine who is also very active in the Democratic Party, and we kind of came to an agreement after some discussion that this isn't so much the future of the party right now for this election, on whether or not we're going progressive or whether or not we're going moderate. This is more an election to try and go against Trump. It's, as my colleague called it, a referendum election, a referendum on Trump's presidency thus far. I am not super thrilled about either candidate. I definitely like Bernie more than Biden, but I have considerable concerns about Bernie's ability to not just govern, but also to build a coalition to be able to accomplish anything. So that's my thoughts on this. I could have an entire video on my thoughts on the Democratic Party, but I'm not going to do that this week. I imagine I'll do that in the run up to the election. One of these weeks, I will have just a real deep dive into the Democratic Party as a whole. So I need to adjust my camera a little bit. What I want to talk about this week is something that is near and dear to my heart, and near and dear to the heart of many of my colleagues, many of my friends, and many people that I work with, many people who I know. And that is poverty. Now, not just any poverty, I'm talking more exclusively generational poverty. Now, generational poverty is kind of a broad term, but the easiest way to describe it is the fact that families who have been poor for generations, who have been impoverished for generations. You see this most common amongst not just people on a lower socioeconomic setting, but also you see this amongst a real disparity in racial groups as well. And I'm going to try and tackle some of that. It's not going to be the easiest because this is a huge topic that this could make an entire class, an entire novel, or not an entire book. This is an entire thing, is generational poverty. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about generational poverty, what it means for the country and for the people who are in these generational divides, and also some ways that we can try and combat it. This video is probably going to be a little longer than 10 minutes, so for that I apologize. But let's get down to business, okay? So what I want to tackle first is, what is generational poverty? Now, I gave you kind of the general definition that it is poverty throughout generations of families, but let's actually dive a little bit more into what it is and how it came to be. So I want to tackle it first from what it means for families. So what it means for families is that they, particularly the children, don't have as many role models or don't have as much financial savvy because they were never taught from their families exactly how to break the cycle of poverty, because we are all defined by our experiences. And if someone has only ever experienced poverty, it's unlikely that they'll understand necessarily the ways to break out of it. And if your grandparents were poor and your parents were poor, there's a really high likelihood of you being poor. Now, there are a lot of other outside external factors that go into that as well, but that's kind of a general overview of what generational poverty is. So now let's tackle how it came to be. So again, there are a multitude of reasons. I'm only going to briefly touch on a handful of them, but here they are. So one of the key ones is, if you are surrounded by poverty, you don't have, like I mentioned before, you don't have the role models necessarily to break out of the cycle of poverty. And there are a lot of other factors into how they got into that position in the first place. One of the key showings of poverty is if you started off poor. Now, there was a great philosopher named Everlast in his hit song called What It's Like, who said a line that I think I might joke about him being a philosopher, but I think is actually really true. And that is, Where you end often depends on where you start. And that's key. If you start in a tough situation, if you start a situation where you're food insecure, where you are housing insecure, you're not going to spend as much time focusing on like the ways to break out of the cell you've been painted into. Now, most people do not choose to be poor. There are countless reasons as to why poverty exists, ranging from medical costs, ranging from social concerns, ranging from, in many cases, outright racism, to make it very challenging for people of a minority to break out of what they first found themselves in. And a lot of this goes back to, I mean, truly, slavery is a huge aspect. Particularly, you look at a lot of impoverished populations. Some of your poorer populations are your African American population, are your Native American population, and are your Latino population. Now, there are certainly exceptions to the rule, but you certainly see a lot more of that compared to someone who is, say, white. In a lot of ways, they still have some external concerns as to why they aren't succeeding, but a lot of times it's a little bit less structural than from a minority. And I'm going to tackle particularly the African American population and Latino population because that is really what I see more of in my work when I did legal services and in my work today. But I definitely do want to touch on Native Americans because in many regards, Native American reservations have some of the highest poverty rates, have some of the lowest standards of living. And a lot of that goes back to, I mean, truly and effectively, the cultural genocide that the United States committed during their westward expansion. Now, that's also a whole nother video in itself, but a major problem is there were diseases that took out a very robust population. There were just an aggressive nation trying to expand. And there are also just the fact that there are a lot of things that were designed to eliminate the cultural identity and make it so it was almost impossible for them to succeed. In fact, Adolf Hitler took a lot of inspiration for his final solution and the Holocaust from the American genocide of the native tribes. So that's where that's where my light touch on that. So let's actually go into the African American and Latino populations now. So particularly what I see around here is there have been a lot of regards of African Americans post-slavery and even obviously pre-slavery were inherently second-class citizens by the majority of the electorate. There were a lot of laws that were put in place to disenfranchise them, and we still see a lot of that today with voter ID laws and other ways that powerful individuals have really disenfranchised these entire populations. And one key reason for that was the process of redlining. Now, redlining was basically an arbitrary line on the road that said, well, these places here are going to get federal funds where these places will not. And it was exclusively used to disenfranchise African Americans as they came north. In fact, like the North has some higher segregation rates than the South now due to these redlining aspects. And it also led to an issue in education, in which a lot of schools get their money from property taxes. In a lot of your more impoverished neighborhoods, property taxes aren't as high because it's not as desirable of an area because it's impoverished, which turns into a cycle of poverty in which we can't pay for the school because we're a poor community, and we can't break out of our poor community because we don't fund the schools. And it's a real vicious cycle that really begins and ends with the redlining. And you see the same with the Latino population as well, particularly in areas like Springfield, which has a large, robust Latino population. You can see the schools that are in suburban white neighborhoods have higher test rates, you can pay the teachers more, whereas in your lower income areas, you don't have the same thing. I live in one of the most diverse areas of Springfield, Ward 6. in which we have some suburban homes. We have some really old homes that are worth a lot of money, and we also have a lot of poor neighborhoods. And it's really kind of interesting place to look at. And it helps build attention and helps build some education, like as in personal education on how other people survive. Now, you and I were very privileged growing up. We went to a good school. We had parents who were around, parents who took an interest in our schooling, and we were never housing insecure, nor were we ever food insecure. Those two factors are one of the largest impacts on a cycle of poverty. Let's tackle housing insecurity first, because that's one that I know considerably more about, considering my past as a housing attorney. So, housing insecure means you don't have housing that you know you're going to go back to. You don't have a house that you can make your payments on. You don't have a rent that you can always make your payments on. And it leads to some severe trauma, particularly for younger individuals. Because child development is such, and particularly social development, is such a key aspect of building yourself as a person. And when you're housing insecure, you might end up at this school for a year and a half, but then your parents can't pay the rent, so they're evicted, they go somewhere else. And there are two things that impact that. First off it's just the social impacts of you don't get to build a long-standing a long-standing relationship with other individuals, nor do you necessarily have your relationship with professors, with guidance counselors, with people who can actually push you towards, or not even push you, but guide you towards a better future, because your family is housing insecure. And so you're going to go to several other houses, several other homes, several other neighborhoods, even several other cities, or at least some parts of cities. Someone could be from our Forest Park area where I live now, and they can be evicted, and the only place they can get to would be, say, in Indian Orchard, which is a whole nother community. And those relationships that you've built here in Forest Park are now non-existent, particularly with the school, because now you're going elsewhere and you have to rebuild a lot of social relationships. And it's traumatic in no small part for developing individuals. And it also leads to job insecurity for the parents and for the people who are of working age. Because one key thing for most places where you work is, can you effectively get there? If you can't effectively get there, that's really hard to keep the job, and a lot of employers won't even hire you if you don't have reliable transportation to get to work. And it's sad, and it's a real big issue that isn't thought of as much when you consider reasons for poverty. And now let's go a little more into the food insecure aspect of poverty. Now, being food insecure means, just at its basis level, it's difficult for you to get good, healthy meals because food is expensive. Healthy foods are expensive. A lot of times in impoverished areas, you will have a family who will go to the Dollar Tree to get what they can for food. And that food's not as high quality, it's not as healthy, and it has a lot of extra aspects to it that don't complement a healthy diet. But it's what you can afford. And this leads to severe health issues, leads to other severe issues, can lead to mental breakdowns. If you're stuck between paying rent or being able to put food on the table for your family that's hungry, that's going to be a hard decision. Most families are going to choose the food because it's a more immediate need. Your rent bill is certainly a major need, but it's not as immediate as getting food or water. In places like Flint, you see that they are not only food insecure, but they are water insecure. If you're water insecure, then it's almost impossible to really accomplish anything. Your property rates are lowest of the low because no one wants to live there, which means your schools will have a lot less money, which means they'll have a lot less trained teachers, a lot lower paid teachers, and in a lot of regards, they won't have the same organizations, the same communities that a more successful school district would have. And again, let's compare Kent to Ravenna.
Kent had a real vibrant schooling system because it was wealthier. They never failed a levy. They never had issues, and we were never worried about not getting a good education. In Ravenna, you don't have that same benefit, and you can see that where I live now. Compare Springfield to East Longmeadow. East Longmeadow is considerably more suburban, considerably wealthier. Their schooling is much, much better than we have here in Springfield. And so now let's actually get into some substantive ways to actually try and break the cycle of poverty. One of the key ways that I am absolutely for is there needs to be an increase in education access, increase in access to qualified teachers, increase access to after-school activities, because all of those things help develop. They help build a community. They help build a support system for someone to hopefully succeed. Again, you and I were very lucky to have a wonderful support system around us. Not everyone is. And that is a huge issue, and that helps impact this cycle of poverty. Now, there are a lot of ways that I have in my mind to be able to adjust this education disparity, but they're not easy, they're not cheap, and they're going to take an awful lot of work. Now, one of the key things is in the aspect of then you need to stop making property prices control the prices of your schooling, because that is a way to immediately discriminate against lower income individuals, because they're going to be in lower income communities, they're going to have lower income housing, and their property prices just quite frankly aren't going to be as high. The school's not going to get as much of a tax break in that regard, and therefore the school can't hire these teachers. They can't hire specialists. Instead, you might hire some generalists, but they won't provide the same educational benefit that you'd have elsewhere. Another thing that you should do is get rid of standardized testing. Standardized testing has really accomplished nothing. It's actually caused more disinterest in schooling because you're not learning what to put in on a test. Now, people who support things like the No Child Left Behind Act or other testings will say, no, this is a good objective way to test education levels. And it's not. I noticed it with the bar exam, and there have been a lot of lawyers who have complained about the bar exam or the LSAT because it's not a substantive way to actually show one's knowledge. It shows one's ability to take a test. And there are also a million and one different aspects into why people may or may not be able to do well on tests. Test anxiety is a major thing, especially when you have something like the OGT, in which your entire future is dependent on how you do on this test. Now, it wasn't, at least for me, it was not a particularly difficult test, but still, it caused no small part of anxiety and test anxiety, which impacts the way you think. It makes you second guess yourself. Places like Finland and other places in the Baltic states and Scandinavia have gotten rid of a lot of these standardized tests, and their education systems are some of the best in the world. Now, the United States, it's not an apples-to-apples comparison between the United States and places like Scandinavia, because the United States is much larger, there's a much larger income disparity, and there is a much greater diversity in students, teachers, educational districts, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not a one-size-fits-all thing, but it's a step in the right direction. You need to have more investment in education, more investment in guidance counselors, and honestly, more investment in pushing up trade schools. There are many people who I know who would never have succeeded in school, but they went to a trade school and they make more than someone who went to college, and they don't have the same debts. So if you have guidance counselors who push up trade schools and really focus on a more investment into trade schools, that can also help give people a profession, give them experience, make them more employable. The next thing I would do would be to help stop the school to prison pipeline. And you see this particularly in lower income areas. The school to prison pipeline is basically these students went to school, or maybe they didn't, they might have dropped out, or they might have not been very enthused to go to school. And it leads, in a lot of regards, to long prison sentences. Now, criminal justice reform is another huge topic that I could do an entire video on, but I'm going to try and dial that back a little bit. In a lot of ways, our criminal justice system right now is all about incarceration and not so much about rehabilitation. There are people who I know who serve time in prison, who, because they did something dumb when they were 18, they served 2, 3, 4 years in prison because they did this dumb thing, and it's immediately made them difficult for them to go to school, unemployable in a lot of regards, and it puts them in a situation in which they're surrounded by people who, in some regards, might not be the best influences. There are a lot of prison gangs, and just the very nature of mass incarceration that we have in America as is flawed at its very core, because it doesn't solve the underlying issue on why crime happens. Most people don't choose to be criminals because they want to be criminals. They're usually socioeconomic factors in which, like, one social aspect is, say I'm 13, say I see my parents or my grandparents or my neighbor who goes to work every day, works a low-wage job, comes home, and doesn't have enough to like buy vehicles, doesn't have enough to buy anything, doesn't have enough money to actually live rather than survive. Whereas I see the gangster down the street has all the fastest cars, all the prettiest women, and all of the connections that he would need in this area. If I'm an impressionable youth, what am I going to look at? Would I see the person who does an honest day's work and gets nothing for it? Or would I want to be the gangster who is living the high life? That's a real intoxicating aspect that makes it really challenging to break the cycle, because the school to prison pipeline, you spend time in prison, it's very difficult to get a job, particularly a good job. You might get jobs, but they won't be the good jobs that you need. They won't be your engineers, your government workers, or even, like in my case, like a lawyer. Because a lot of places, if you have, even to be a lawyer, if you're an ex-convict, it's really, really hard to pass the character and fitness aspect of the bar exam, because of something, again, say you did something stupid as a kid. And all of these aspects go together to a generational poverty. And it's not easy to break this, but it's something that we need to do. And one key thing, along with the increase in education, is help increase housing security. Now, much can be said on the housing market, much can be said on the landlord-tenant market, in which landlords can charge a lot of money for apartments that aren't really worth it and make it exceptionally challenging for someone working a low-wage job to pay off. And by a low-wage job, I mean like not just your fast food workers everyone always brings up, but your EMTs don't make a lot. Your sanitation workers don't make a lot. A lot of these key jobs that make the world, they make us thrive, aren't paid well because it's considered unskilled labor. Whereas, like, I'll be honest and say, without our sanitation workers, we would be living in filth and we would be disease-ridden. They are one of the most important parts of our functioning society, and they should be paid like it. Like, it's telling that minimum wage cannot afford any two-bedroom apartment in the country, and minimum wage can't afford most one-bedroom apartments. Like, Taylor and I are lucky where we live right now is a very cheap apartment for what we get, but it's still far more expensive than what it is probably worth if the market rate wasn't so high. So to increase lower rental rates, increase housing security, that's a key thing to do. One thing that I would do would be essentially set up tiers via income, in which, say, because I'm a firm believer in everyone deserves a home, everyone deserves a place to stay. It's a key aspect on Maslow's hierarchy of needs to have shelter, food, and water. If you don't have one of those things, or if one of those things is insecure, you spend a lot more time worrying about that, focusing on that, and not focusing on education, or not focusing on things for your future, or not focusing on savings. And many people are one missed paycheck away from being impoverished. And a lot of that is because housing prices are just so high. So to set up like a tier list of, so you want to have a 1-bedroom apartment, say you make $10 an hour, therefore I'm only going to, the landlord should only be able to charge you, say, like $300 for a month. Whereas someone who makes $100,000 in a month should have to pay higher rates. Now that's a tough sell, and I'm using it really just as a broad example, but that's one thing that I would do, would be set up tiers to help make it so housing is more secure. You should have a better access to food and a better access to public transportation. Many impoverished individuals use public transportation, which is predominantly buses, because the buses are fairly inexpensive. But the bus is also limited to, you can only work in areas on the bus path. So one thing that could also be a benefit would be increase in other forms of public transportation, like a subway or like a high-speed rail, in which this opens up a much larger opportunity for you to be able to work not just in your core neighborhood, but maybe in a different state that could offer more money for you. And that's one key thing that could help, at least in part, impact breaking the cycle of poverty. And a third thing would be making it so being food secure is simpler as well. Have more healthy options for your food, have better benefits through things like food stamps or other forms of transitional assistance. And that could help make you food secure. So now and also just focus on, government should give you better water, right? Better ways for water. An example, again, I'll use Flint. It's not an easy fix for them to do, but it's a fix they've needed to do for years, and the property prices there have collapsed. Many youths are now have severe health issues because of all that lead in the water, and the government didn't do enough to really help them out. Now, the biggest question is always going to be, how are you going to pay for this? And a lot of that is, yes, taxes would probably increase, but there are also ways to not increase taxes, but cut budgets in other places that aren't as needed. For example, like defense spending is something that is absolutely necessary, and I'm not going to say anything besides that, because it is defense of a country is also very high on that list of needs, because if you don't have that defense, then all of those insecure issues that I mentioned before, food, housing, and water, just get worse, get exacerbated. You can see in a place like Yemen, in which they don't have that same defense. They've been constantly bombed by foreign adversaries, and they have one of the lowest rates of success in the entire world. Also look at places like Sub-Saharan Africa, particularly Sudan. And so, but you could cut defense spending from certain regards. Like, do we need to build all of these extra things? Do we need to build a space force? Probably not. Do we need to build a wall that might or might not work? Probably not. And a lot of the funds that went to that could then be moved back to like education rates and things, not education, like education departments and things like that. These are not easy fixes. These are large structural problems that will take a long time to fix. But the things we can fix if we take the steps needed for it. And it's something that, through my involvement in politics and just through my involvement in news and through my involvement in looking at things, these are major problems that we haven't done enough to combat. And poverty is not good for anyone. It really is not. It makes a less educated workforce, makes a less educated populace, makes your capitalistic
chance is lower because we live in a consumer-based economy in which a lot of the way the economy runs is by people spending money. If you're impoverished, it's really hard for you to spend money because you don't have what you need for it. There are also like health, like a Medicare for all or a public option even would be a large step in that right direction too, because a major cost that many people have and a major reason for poverty is healthcare costs. You're one operation away from being hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, and it could be something that's by no means your fault. Like we can bring up now, the coronavirus is certainly, I think, being a little overblown, but it's still a major issue. And you can look at if someone gets that disease, someone has to spend an extensive time in the hospital. Let's say they survive, say everything works out fine, but you still spent 2-3 days in the hospital. You're going to get a sizable bill towards you if you're uninsured or underinsured. And many Americans are both. So that's one other step that you could take to try and combat this poverty. There are a lot of steps to take, and there's certainly a push to do this. Because again, poverty is not good for anyone. It doesn't help communities. It doesn't help the state, because the state then has to pay more on, say, transitional assistance, or has to pay more on Social Security for someone who can't work due to something or another. And all of these things could be combated if we spend the time, and if we spend the resources, and if we actually can pass legislation to start getting this together. So Tony, this was a really long video that covered a really big subject. But tell me, what do you think on both generational poverty and ways to fix it? Tony, I'll see you on Wednesday. Later, bro.